Hello, everybody. It is 2:05 Eastern Standard Time, and thank you to everyone for joining Refugee Sponsorship Training Program today for this webinar. My name is Stu, and I'm the Blended Visa Office Referred Worker at the Refugee Sponsorship Training Program. Today with me, I have Teresa Hastek, Resettlement Associate with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR. I will be recording today's webinar, so if you'd like to get a copy, please let me know after the webinar, and I will be more than happy to share it with you. Before we start, I would like to first provide a little bit of information regarding RSTP. RSTP is mandated and funded by the Immigration, Refugee, Citizenship Canada, IRCC, to provide training and support to current and potential sponsoring organizations and groups. Our office is located in Scarborough, Ontario, but we service the whole country, excluding Quebec. Our office is also responsible for matching sponsoring groups with refugees coming to Canada through the Blended Visa Office Referred Program. Teresa will start this webinar by first providing a brief description of the profiles of Eritrean refugees, including those selected for resettlement. She will also provide some information on the main countries of asylum for Eritrean refugees. Then she will get into a discussion on the prospects of durable solutions, including resettlement for Eritrean refugees. I will then provide an explanation as to how the BVOR program can be used to help refugees identified and referred for resettlement by UNHCR. Then we'll have a question and answer period at the end. Please type in your questions in the question box during the question and answer period, and I will read out the questions and we'll try to provide an answer. I would like to also go over some of the acronyms we commonly use before we start. So in case you hear them during the webinar, you know what they are. So RSCP stands for Refugee Sponsorship Training Program. IRCC stands for Immigration, Refugee, and Citizenship Canada. UNHCR stands for United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. BVOR is Blended Visa Office Referred Program. PSR is Private Sponsorship of Refugees. GARS is Government Assistant Refugees, and SAWs are Sponsorship Agreement Holders. I will now pass on the presentation to Teresa.
Hi everyone, this is Teresa from UNHCR in Ottawa. As Stu explained, I will start with just giving an overview on who we are, how resettlement works briefly, try to give you a bit of a background on the countries of asylum where most of the Eritrean refugees are coming to Canada, so in Sudan and Ethiopia. And also a bit of information about the profiles of your Eritrean refugees that UNHCR is selecting and submitting to resettlement states, including to Canada. So I'll start with a bit of a description of who we are. We are a UNHCR, UN Agency for Refugees, so we are part of the United Nations family. We've been created a long time ago in 1950 with a goal to really find solutions for 2 million Europeans after the Second World War. And at the time, the world believed, the international community believed that we will resolve that problem in 3 years. So we had a 3-year mandate. And 67 years later, we are still around, unfortunately. A lot more conflicts have happened. And we have also been given additional responsibilities, not just for refugees, and I'll talk about that on the next slide. So we are present in more than 120 countries. Our staff is quite diverse, from lawyers who normally work as protection officer. We have lots of experts, logisticians, water and sanitation specialists, doctors, so on. Our main headquarters are in Geneva, in Switzerland, but we are also present in donor countries, important donor countries like US, Canada, EU, and so on. So we are a non-political organization and a humanitarian organization, so not only that we try to provide life-saving assistance, we also try to safeguard some fundamental human rights, such as a right to seek asylum when there is a war and conflict, or when individuals face persecution on various grounds and are forced to cross the border and seek protection somewhere else. Our funding comes mainly from donor governments. Canada is one important donor, but also increasingly we are trying also to fundraise with from private citizens, and because we are governments are unreliable and we have to diversify. Gaps in funding directly have an impact on the populations of concern to us. Oops, I'm sorry, something. Here we are. So trying to explain also who are people under our concern to us. Who do we help? Primarily refugees and asylum seekers. So a big difference between the two, if you can imagine a conflict happening somewhere and people fleeing in big numbers, crossing the borders into neighboring countries, or even those who have to, hop on a plane with a visitor's visa and with the intention to seek asylum somewhere else. When they cross that international border with the intention to seek asylum, they are asylum seekers. In that neighboring country or in a third country where they are, when they apply for international protection and they go through a process, whether through our agency or through the local government process, and they are recognized, they go through a hearing, then they become refugees, either mandate UNHCR refugees or convention refugees if they are recognized by a state. In addition to those two big groups, we also assist refugees to return to their country. We call these people returnees. So when a situation is changes and returns to the country of origin are possible, our role is also to monitor the reception conditions and everything else, so that when these people who used to be refugees are coming back, also have something to return to. In more recent times, we are more involved with internally displaced, so people who are displaced because of a conflict but still inside of their own country. Mostly with the humanitarian assistance distribution front. We are also a lot more involved with stateless people. One of our goals is to abolish statelessness. Stateless people are those who do not have any nationality. So no state want to give them nationality. They don't belong anywhere. And some of refugees, some people among refugees are also stateless refugees. In the recent years, we have also been asked to assist by the big UN in the relief efforts when natural disasters occur, such as earthquake, tsunami, and so on. So in addition to ensuring protection for refugees and asylum seekers wherever they are, we also try to provide solutions. And when we talk about solutions, durable solutions to the forced displacement, we talk about these three: voluntary repatriation, local integration, and resettlement. Voluntary repatriation nowadays is a solution that rarely happens. We are having these long conflicts, people where international community doesn't get engaged, and they last for years and years. So this is really a rare occurrence, if I can say so. Local integration would entail that people who have obtained asylum somewhere else are given full integration, not only legal, but also economic, social, cultural. And finally, resettlement, which is our topic, is used primarily as a tool of protection. We want to ensure that people who do not have access to protection in the countries of asylum, that we are able to move them to third countries such as Canada, US, Australia, and so on. And also, we want to ensure that the countries that take the brunt of hosting refugees, which are mostly third world countries such as Pakistan, Lebanon, Turkey, that there is a responsibility sharing in the international community. So we have about 36 countries, I believe, which are participating in the refugee resettlement programs, but the big three countries are the US, Canada, and Australia. So just so you have an idea how things work, so if you can imagine a refugee or asylum seekers influx somewhere else, people are fleeing a conflict, they're crossing the border, what happens, and when does resettlement kick in as an opportunity for someone? Usually what happens is people cross in big numbers, and depending where they go, they will meet either UNHCR officials or local government officials of a neighboring country, let's say, who will try to register them as asylum seekers. This is a very important part because it ensures that they have access to services available to them. Then normally in the majority of situations they will be individually interviewed, or maybe a country will decide to give them prima facie status, meaning that they will just declare that population as refugees because they are fleeing a legitimate cause. And numbers are huge. We have currently 22 million refugees around the world. So obviously not all of them will be able to be resettled somewhere else. Resettlement as a protection tool kicks in when we are dealing with extremely vulnerable people whom we need to move out. It's a life-saving tool in a way. So through our regular work, protection officers, community services, doctors, whomever we have either in refugee camps or in urban centers, when they identify families that are particularly vulnerable for whatever reason, they would be flagged in our system, in our databases, as potential resettlement case. So we would create submissions or profiles, primarily working through such identification of cases that's happening through our everyday work in the field. All of these people that are, let's say, flagged as particularly vulnerable will fit into one or more of these categories that you see in front of you. What is common for Eritrean refugees, both in Sudan and in Ethiopia, is that in both of these countries there are no really alternative solutions for these people. So all of them will be resettled because there are no other alternatives, but they will also have a stronger criteria that we've used. You know, they are either victims of torture, let's say because they were exposed to very harsh punishment because they deserted, you know, Eritrean army, or they have been you know, maybe exposed to kidnapping, in particular in Sudan. A lot of people who try to move northwards towards Libya, you know, are at prey of smugglers. So that's sometimes they go through very difficult time. I have to say that for the medical needs, a number of cases will have some medical needs, but most resettlement countries also limit the number of cases that UNHCR can refer on medical needs. So, but there will be some cases with significant medical needs that we try to find a solution, and these would be people who cannot access medical treatment in the country where they are. Women and girls at risk, I will be talking a bit more about this particular profile when discussing in particular the Eritrean population. And as far as family reunification, we do not really in the Canadian context use it a lot because people who are in Canada will have access to the Canadian immigration existing programs. You may have heard about family class, spousal applications, or, you know, for dependent children, or one-year window applications. So we will not use these precious resettlement places for cases like that. We would expect these people to come through the regular immigration process. And as far as children are concerned, Canadian policy, the Canadian government policy is that we can only refer those who have a blood relative in Canada. So these are actually very small numbers, and the majority of the children and adolescents at risk will be resettled to the United States that has a good foster system in place. The next slide, I'll just briefly tell you that we can flag cases that we submit to resettlement states as emergency, urgent, or normal. If we are dealing with a life-threatening situation, we can submit a case and request the visa office to process them within 7-day limit. We have had very successful cases, but these are very rare cases too. Let's say if someone is threatened with refoulement, forcible return to the country of origin, this is what we would use as a tool of protection. Urgent cases, we would still request expedited processing, but they're not as urgent as emergency. And the majority of cases, and I would say probably all of the blended visa officers referred cases are coming under normal priority. So we would allow visa office to use their time to process the cases as fast as possible, of course, but the majority are submitted under the normal priority. So moving now a bit more in detail about this particular situation that's of interest to you. So I will speak a little bit first about Eritreans in Sudan, and then about Eritreans in Ethiopia, and then give later on some common characteristics of the population. So you see the map in front of you, and these numbers that you see are just for Eritreans. Of course, there are other refugees in Sudan. I mean, there's close to 500,000 refugees in Sudan of various nationalities, you know, from Central African Republic, from Chad, from Somalia, from South Sudan, Yemen, and Syria. The big majority of these people are in the camps. Some 270,000 people are in the camps. The rest is in Khartoum. But Sudan kind of, you know, the government prefers people to be in the camps. So most of them are in Eastern Sudan. And of course, there are a lot of those who are in Darfur as well. As far as Eritrean refugees in the camps are, they are all in the east. There are 9 camps, and the situation is pretty bad. I mean, they live under difficult conditions. We estimate that half of the residents of the camp live in absolute poverty. In Sudan, I'll just bring you back to when I was talking about the registration and the refugee status determination. In Sudan, actually, the state of Sudan, the government is the party to the 1951 convention. So they have their own institution that basically decides who is a refugee. And it's called Sudanese Commissioner for Refugees. People are pre-screened before they are able to register by the Sudanese National Intelligence Service. They use biometrics when people register. So in that respect, there is no possibility of stealing someone's identity, from when they cross into the country up until they, let's say, leave for resettlement to states like Canada or US and so on. All of the registration in Sudan is happening in the camps. It is simply impossible to register in Khartoum. I mentioned this just because maybe some of you are also involved in fully privately sponsoring refugees, and it's important. It's impossible to get an exit permit if an individual is not registered. It is also important to seek permission when people want to leave the camps. They need to seek permission. Otherwise, if they just leave on their own, they can be arrested and, subject to difficult situation in detention. UNHCR in Sudan is able to intervene, but it is quite tough. A lot of people in Sudan, refugees in Sudan, try to move north. Try to move into Libya, try to cross towards Mediterranean into EU, European Union. And one of the reasons why UNHCR and resettlement states, such as Canada, try to get engaged more in the resettlement programs was really to ensure that these people can see some opportunities for orderly resettlement and solutions, and also to show that the international community is there to assist, even if it's small numbers compared to the overall needs. I mentioned already that there are no really opportunities for people, like alternatives. They remain there for a long time, and they're unable really to work, in a formal sector. And the country, as such, has a very poor economic situation. So. Amongst many refugees, we try to identify those who are extremely vulnerable. Of course, looking at other solutions, voluntary returns to Eritrea are not possible. We do not promote any returns to that country. So looking from these two perspectives, the only solution that remains available is resettlement. The problem, of course, for UNHCR is that spaces are limited. So unfortunately, we have to triage. We have to find those who are the neediest, who are the most vulnerable. And basically, some of these people will be processed through the Blended Visa Officer Program, and it's a great way to help take additional people and contribute that way. I will move on to the situation in Ethiopia. You see the map. This map is, provides the number of overall number of refugees and asylum seekers, which is over 800,000 refugees and asylum seekers in Ethiopia from many countries. Somalia, Eritrea, South Sudan, Sudan itself, Kenya, Yemen, and so on. So Ethiopia has a similar encampment policy like Sudan. So they basically request refugees to stay in the camps. And the great majority of them live in the camps. Some 700,000 people live in 36 camps, settlements, and various transit sites around the country. Ethiopia, as well as Sudan, has signed the 1951 Convention. They also have their own institution that deals with refugee status determination. That institution is called Administration for Refugee and Returnee Affairs. Populations, the majority of refugee populations, interestingly, in Ethiopia, which is very generous of them, are recognized on a prima facie basis. So South Sudanese, who are the largest group, refugee group in Ethiopia, almost 45% of the refugee population are South Sudanese. Then Somalis and the population of our interest today, Eritreans, all of them are recognized on a prima facie basis. So that means that there are no individual interviews. People register, and unless something comes up to exclude them from the refugee definition, let's say if a person has committed acts against humanity that would exclude them from the refugee definition, everybody is basically accepted and has refugee status. In Ethiopia, it is also very important to register. It's important because of the exit permits. But it's also important because people can face other risks, if they remain illegal and try to live in the shadows for many years. On the side of the alternative solutions, there isn't much that's available. There is basically something, a good development that happened around 2010. The government of Ethiopia introduced what they call out-of-camp policy. And that allows some Eritreans who can prove that they can sustain themselves outside of the camps, they allow them to live outside of the camps. But at the same time, these people cannot get work permits to work in a formal economy, or to open a business, or even to have a driver's license. So it is extremely difficult to prove that you can sustain yourself if you are not allowed to get all of that. There are some signals recently that the government may be willing to open up this policy to other nationalities and also ease these restrictions on work permits. But some of these people who were able to benefit from this policy would be, people who have family and friends overseas who are funding their stay in Addis, or people who have been able to, attend, schools in Addis as well. Of course, you would have to have someone to pay for you to be able to do that. But overall, for the majority of the population, it is pretty bad. There are, unfortunately, because all of our operations are underfunded. In Ethiopia, concretely, only 23% of our needs are funded. So this has an impact on the reduction in services for refugees. We have had a terrible drought there, so that's kind of even worsened the situation for the people of concern to us. And all of that is quite complex, and we are not the only international agency that has these issues. You know, food assistance is diminishing simply because World Food Program, you know, doesn't have enough funds to meet all the needs. So, looking at that, it's quite desperate. This is just a brief overview for you with respect to, you know, who are these people. If you're not familiar, you know, it's Eritrean population. You know, the majority of them are either of Muslim or Christian faiths. There are some 9 ethnic groups that you can see there. In Sudan, long stayers, you know, so Eritreans who arrived many years ago are able to communicate in Arabic, but recent arrivals, of course, are, you know, have not acquired that skill. So in Sudan specifically, they will have some issues, you know, accessing the services if there are no interpreters available. But depending on when your particular case, if you're interested in picking up a BVOR profile, when they arrived and when they are, they may have these language skills as opposed to, you know, only what's what they have as their ethnic language. This is just briefly to explain, you know, what are these profiles that we refer to for resettlement. There will be refugees who came a long time ago when Eritrea basically started, well, when Eritrea got the independence. These people have fled mostly to Sudan, and there were some in Ethiopia, but that population, in terms of, you know, it has been resolved through the Ethiopian national law, whom they've accepted to give the nationality, and the others who were pushed back towards Eritrea. But in Sudan, those who arrived, you know, are long stayers. And, you know, if you look at this percentage, like that, the 55% of the camp population are actually children born to the parents who fled a long time ago. So these children of these people have never really been in Eritrea. So others fled during the border war, mostly to Sudan, of course. But what is more recent is that young people flee Eritrea, trying really to escape the conscription to the military service. The military service in Eritrea is practically indefinite, so this is what's extremely harsh, and harsh conditions as well. So we are seeing situations of parents sending their quite young children out of the country for fear of early conscription, and so our colleagues both in Sudan and Ethiopia are dealing with a very high number of unaccompanied minors. Not all of these kids will be resettled, of course. Some of them join their relatives who are already refugees in these countries. Some of them join relatives who are refugees in Europe or in Canada through various family reunification programs. But there are those for whom, you know, we are unable to find solutions. So as I mentioned before, you know, some of these people who fled due to these reasons, we would have, you know, a number of victims of torture who may have been exposed to torture, what you call like really harsh punishment for, attempting to desert the army and they were caught. Or maybe the people tried to transit going north and they were captured by smugglers, kept in captivity and tortured as well. So maybe some of these cases would be referred if we are aware of them. We would have a number of medical cases, and then of course, a number of women at risk. This is not unique to the Eritrean population. We see this pattern happening in any refugee situation. There is a breakdown in traditional protection mechanisms. You have in a normal surrounding, a protection provided by fathers, husbands, brothers, like, a male authority. And when people flee, they don't flee always together. It happens that, the male members of the family stay behind, or maybe are unable to flee. So women and girls basically are at higher risk of exploitation. They try to make a living, so we have a number of victims of who were engaged in survival sex, early pregnancies, early or forced marriages. So as I mentioned, this is not just unique to the Eritrean population. We've seen that in the Syrian context, in the Iraqi context, and so on. In Ethiopia, even though we have tried to put some preventative measures, there have been cases, because resources are so scarce, right? Women and girls go, kind of far from the camps looking for firewood, and as such, they also become very often victims of sexual and gender-based violence. So this is something that can easily be prevented. However, funding may be the issue in some places, and it's unfortunate, but that's the reality. It still happens. Also, some of the profiles that you may see would be people who flee Eritrea because of their religious beliefs. In Eritrea, there are only four state-recognized official religions, and anybody else who practices something else is basically seriously persecuted. So people who are not Eritrean Orthodox or Lutherans or practice Islam or Roman Catholics, they will be seriously persecuted, and they will, some of them find a way to flee the persecution and find safety somewhere else. So some of these profiles that you may see are basically leaving their country because of that reason, not necessarily a draft evasion. So I'm coming to the end of my part of the presentation, and I would just like to wrap up things, really encouraging you to pick up a BVOR profile. You see in front of you the number of refugees that UNHCR has already identified as particularly vulnerable. 1.2 million refugees. We would like to resettle them, and we don't have sufficient spaces. You may know that UNHCR, when we refer cases to Canada, we have 2 programs available. The Canadian government decides towards which program they will send cases, so government-assisted or a GAR program, and then BVOR program or Blended Visa Office Refer program. But all of these cases are identified and referred by UNHCR. So for 2017, it's only 9,000 people who will come through these two programs combined, and we are really hopeful that the blended visa officer target will be met, because it just simply ensures that we have helped as many people as possible. Just to give you one additional information, and then I will finish. Looking globally, I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that there are some 36 countries that have resettlement programs. So when we combine all of these countries, we only have 93,000 places available globally. Canada's part is 25. This is with privately sponsored, and I'm sure that a lot of you do that as well. But out of these, 9,000 are those that we've selected. If you look at that, you do the math, and it's only 9% out of those 1.2 million that will actually get to go somewhere. Everybody else will wait longer. Some of them will die, so help is really needed. I thank you very much, and I'm staying on, of course, after Parastu's part of the presentation to answer if you have any questions. Thank you. Parastu, over to you.
Thank you, Teresa. Thank you, Teresa, for providing an excellent explanation on how UNHCR identifies and refers Eritrean refugees for resettlement. At this time, I will discuss and provide a general overview as how the BVOR program can be used to help sponsor Eritrean refugees that have been identified and referred by UNHCR to be in need of resettlement. The BVOR program is designed to resettle refugees identified by UNHCR and submitted to Canadian visa offices. So what this means, as Teresa explained, UNHCR identifies refugees who are in need of resettlement and submit the name of those refugees to the Canadian visa offices abroad. The Canadian visa offices receives the name of those individuals, and they initiate eligibility and admissibility check. Eligibility is basically a set of criteria that a refugee must meet in order to be able to resettle to Canada. They also do an admissibility check, which is basically a set of criteria that a refugee must meet in order to be allowed to come to Canada. Admissibility checks consist of medical, criminal, and security checks. Medical checks are conducted by authorized doctors by the Canadian government to ensure that the person who is coming to Canada does not have any medical condition that is considered a threat to Canadian public health and safety. The criminal and security checks are conducted to ensure that the person traveling to Canada has not committed any serious crimes such as war crimes. So once they do all of the eligibility and admissibility checks, the person is ready to travel, and we call them being travel ready. So once they become travel ready, the visa office sends the information of those individuals to Resettlement Operations Center, commonly referred to by the acronym ROCO, which is an office with an IRCC. ROCO will then take that information and they will create a profile for those individuals. Then they will share the profile of those individuals with me here at RSTP, and then I would have to find and match these individuals with sponsoring groups in Canada. So by the time I receive the profiles of those individuals, I know they're both eligible and admissible, so I don't have to worry about any of those things. All I need to do is to find a sponsoring group. So now let's talk about the blended aspect of this program. So why is it blended? It is called blended because it's a cost-sharing model. The government and the private sponsoring groups share the financial responsibility for 1 year. The government provides the income support for 6 months of the year through what is called the Resettlement Assistance Program, and the sponsors provide another 6 months of income support plus all of the startup costs. Excuse me. And by startup cost, I mean anything from putting a first and a last for an apartment or furnishing an apartment. However, sponsors are also responsible for the settlement support. This part is not shared. The settlement support includes receiving them at the airport, setting them up with an accommodation, enrolling them in language classes, and etc. Again, this part is not shared, so as the startup cost. So now that you know your responsibility, that you have financial responsibility and your responsibility as a sponsor, you may be wondering, what does the Government of Canada provide through the Resettlement Assistance Program? So the RAP covers food and incidentals. They provide for basic shelter for that 6 months that they're responsible for providing the financial support. And they also provide for transportation. And they also provide maternity dietary allowances if applicable. And the rates are based on the provincial social assistance rates. So up to now, I've talked about what is the BVOR program and what are the responsibility of sponsors and the government. So now you may be wondering, okay, who can sponsor and how you can get involved. There are currently 3 ways that you can get involved. One is through a sponsorship agreement holder, and another one is through groups of 5 and community sponsors. I will start by first talking about the sponsorship agreement holders. These are incorporated organizations that have signed an agreement with IRCC to sponsor refugees. Sponsorship agreement holders can sponsor directly or through groups. They have authorized to sponsors. Those groups are called constituent groups. Most sponsorship agreement holders are religious, ethnic, community, or service organizations. Excuse me. Then we have community groups of 5, which are 5 Canadian citizens or permanent residents. They must all be 18 years of age or older, and they must all reside within the same community as where the refugee is expected to settle. And the third way of sponsoring is through a community sponsor, which is any organization, association, or corporation. They do not have to be incorporated, but they need to be established as an organization or an association. So these are currently 3 ways that you can sponsor through the BVOR program. As Teresa mentioned, BVOR is meant to respond to the need of refugees in protracted refugee situations. The aim in 2017, the aim is to resettle 1,500 refugees from various population. This includes Syrian, Iraqi, and Iranians, Eritreans, Ethiopians, Congolese, Burundian, Sudanese, Somali, and Uganda, Burmese, and Bhutanese. Majority of the profiles that I have received so far includes a large number of Eritrean refugees and Colombians as well. Sorry. Okay, so now you know that what is the BVOR program, who can be sponsored, and discuss that you share the financial responsibility with the government and not the settlement responsibility. The settlement responsibility is only and needs to be provided by the sponsoring groups. We get into the big question that many of you may have right now. So what does it cost to sponsor a refugee or refugee family through the BVOR program? This slide shows the IRCC cost table for the private refugee sponsorship program, which can also be used for the BVOR program. But for the BVOR program, you're responsible for half of this amount. So this table illustrates the minimum amount of money required for sponsorship under the private refugee sponsorship program. So now let's look at family size 1. Under the 12 months of income support, we have 10,700, and in the second column we have the startup cost, which is 2,800. That is the amount. So the 12 months of income support is 10,700. Because you're sponsoring through, if you're sponsoring through the BVOR program, you're responsible for half of this amount. As mentioned earlier, the startup cost is not shared, so you're responsible for the full startup cost. The figures listed in this case table are roughly equivalent to social assistance rate, and as you're probably aware, they're pretty inadequate. The calculation IRCC used for its share of the financial support is an amount that is not even half of these numbers. So therefore, it is very important to ensure that you have more than half of the amount listed for the family size, for the size of the family you're thinking of sponsoring, because the family will certainly need it. So now that you know your financial responsibility, we'll get into the settlement responsibility. Again, as mentioned previously, this part is not shared, and it's only the sponsor's responsibility. So I'm going to go over some of your settlement responsibility. Some of your settlement responsibility includes reception at the airport, so welcoming them at the airport, providing orientation, explaining to them who you are, explaining the money flow, budgeting, providing orientation with regards to groceries, so where they can buy groceries from, providing orientation with regards to transportation, you know, how they can use transportation if they need to get to places, arranging for temporary accommodation, and then eventually helping them to find a more of a permanent accommodation, helping them with applying for provincial health care, finding a doctor, a dentist, or or other health service providers. You know, helping them with education, enrolling the adults in English or French classes, enrolling their children in school, helping them to apply for child tax benefits, helping them open a bank account, arrange for a translator if it's needed. You would also have to help them with finding helping them with employment, connecting them with job search services, helping them with their resume, and etc. And of course, providing emotional and moral support. It is also very important to connect the newcomers with settlement agencies, as many of the settlement agencies have people who are more specialized in terms of helping these newcomers with settlements. And sometimes you may be able to find a settlement agency that has a settlement worker who speaks the same language as the newcomer. So things will be a lot easier with regards to the settlement. So it's good to look for a settlement agency close to you before the family arrives. So once they come, you can easily connect them, newcomers, with the settlement agency. So we've discussed the financial responsibility and the settlement responsibility. At this point, you may be wondering, how does the matching work? So basically, as I mentioned, I receive a list of available BVOR cases from IRCC, and I make them available to sponsorship agreement holder groups, groups of 5s and community sponsors. At the moment, I receive the list on the last Monday of each month. So if you, this is mainly for people who are thinking of sponsoring, but they're thinking of sponsoring through groups of 5 or community sponsors. So if you're thinking of sponsoring through those 2 categories, you would need to first complete a document called Request for Refugee Profile. I've set out a link here. So once I receive your request, and the next step is for you to partake in an orientation webinar that explains in more detail about the BVOR program. If you're thinking of sponsoring through a sponsorship agreement holder, then you would have to contact your local SLA and speak to them and about the process for sponsoring refugees through the BVOR program. However, regardless of how you're thinking of sponsoring, once I receive the BVOR profiles, I upload them onto RCP matching database. So on the last day of last Monday of each month, I receive the profiles, and I upload them into the matching database, and I send an email notification letting everyone know that the profiles are available and ready to be selected. So once you log into the matching database, you will be able to view the available BVOR profiles and place them on hold. Once you place the profile on hold, you will receive an extended profile that will provide you with more information about the profile that you have selected and placed on hold. The idea of this extended profile is that it will provide you with enough information to you and your group so that you can decide whether or not you have the capacity to sponsor the refugees. So once you receive the extended profile, you have 3 days to decide as to whether or not you would like to sponsor a profile. However, I'm very flexible in terms of extension, as I understand that sometimes it takes more time for a group to get together to make a decision, and sometimes the decision makers are away and the group needs more time, 3 days. So if you need more than 3 days to make a decision, do not hesitate to let me know. If you during that 3 days, if you decided not to proceed with the sponsoring your profile that you have on hold, you can log into the matching database and cancel your hold, and the profile will become available to the other sponsoring groups. If you decide to proceed with the sponsorship, you come back to the matching database and you will confirm the sponsorship. Once you confirm the sponsorship, I will notify ROCO, as I mentioned, it's an office within IRCC, that you have confirmed the sponsorship, and they will send you all the required information to complete the documents. If you're wondering where you can get the documents from, you can find the application forms on IRCC website, but also on our website, which is www.rcp.ca. And there are guidelines and tips as to how you can fill out each form. We also have many people out here at RSDP who can help you with filling out and reviewing the application forms. So don't worry if you need help with the application forms, and if you're not sure how to fill them out, please let us know. We have people who can sit with you, and if you're not in Toronto, we have trainers in other provinces, and we can also check through emails. So we are available and ready to help with the application forms if you need any help. Again, I just want to mention that there are some more details that goes into this, but by the time you get to this point and you're ready to sponsor us, we have already been in touch and probably have become pretty good friends. So again, everything will become a lot more clear once you're ready to actually sponsor. But this is a general overview of how sponsoring through a BVOR program takes place. So once you submit the application forms to IRCC, then 1 to 4 months later, you will receive a notice of arrival, a NAT, with detailed information about the refugees' arrival dates and flights information. It's important to know that refugees arrive as permanent residents, and at that point, the sponsorship obligations begin. Again, it's a cost sharing program. 6 months of it's provided by the government of Canada. 6 months of financial support is provided by private sponsors, plus the settlement support and the startup cost. And once the refugee arrive, your local IRCC will contact you to register them for the income wrap support that the government has agreed to provide for that 6 months. If by any chance, sometimes I receive phone calls from sponsors saying it's been 1 or 2 weeks, the refugee has arrived, but we just haven't heard from the local IRCC. At that point, sometimes sometimes they may forget or they miss it, so it would be okay if you can contact your local IRCC to follow up. And if you don't have their contact information, you can always contact me and I can provide you with their contact information. This brings me to the end of my webinar. At this point, we're going to take any questions that you may have. You can raise your hand and I'm gonna try to unmute you so you can ask your question. Teresa's still on the line, so she will be able to hear your question and respond to you. And you can also type out your questions in the question box. And then I'm going to stop recording the webinar for this period. But again, as I mentioned at the beginning, the webinar was recorded. So if you need a copy of it, please let me know.